So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we are going to look at a chapter out of the book of Job. It is God's response after a long set of dialogues between Job and all his friends. If you're not familiar with the book of Job, it's an epic poem in the old school. It's a bunch of dialogues of these friends. First, we get the framework of a man who suffers immensely and unjustly, and then this man and his group of friends trying to wrestle with what are the causes, what are the effects of this thing. Is Job in fact just, or does he deserve this kind of suffering? It's a wrestling with both suffering and the chaos of the world itself. Obviously, it doesn't lend itself very well to reading a tiny passage of it, picking out themes and all that. And yet this passage, I think, is particularly interesting to use in worship because although we're not going to have the time to obviously look through at all the nuance and the back and forth that goes on in these dialogues, there is a very clean break in the story when Job and his friends have kind of exhausted what they have to say, in which Job has been demanding that God show up and give him answers for what is going on in his life. And then, shocking to all of them, God does in fact show up. Though, as we're going to see looking at this, he doesn't exactly provide answers, most certainly not the answers they were looking for. So let me read this, but as we do so, again, we're missing a lot of the context because we haven't been able to read this, but I think for our purposes, we can recognize all of us have experienced confusion. All of us have experienced times of anger and pain in which we simply do not understand where is God and what is God doing in the world. And there are times when we have demanded answers from God. And so take whatever chaos is going on in your life and let's sit with that for 1 second. And then let's see if God's response to Job in a place of immense pain might be something we can learn from as well, even without the full context of the book of Job overall. So in Job 38, there have been 37 chapters of Job and his friends going back and forth, fighting about this stuff. And then we finally get this passage. And then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, "Who is this darkening counsel, with words lacking knowledge? Prepare yourself like a man. I will interrogate you, and you will respond to me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you know. Who set its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring tape upon it? On what are its footings sunk? Who laid its cornerstone, while the morning stars sang in unison and all the divine beings shouted? Who enclosed the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, the dense clouds its wrap? When I imposed my limit for it, and put a bar indoors and said, you may come this far, but no farther. Here your proud waves stop. In your lifetime have you commanded the morning, informed the dawn of its place, so that it would hold earth by its edges and shake the wicked out of it? Do you turn it over like clay for a seal, so it stands like a colorful garment? Light is withheld from the wicked, and the uplifted arm is broken." And so this response just gives us a taste of how God is going to approach this response of Job and his friends in the place of pain. So the first thing we have to note is this is very classically an Old Testament theophany, right? God is breaking in some sort of a physical sign into our world. This is not an interior, like, sense of feeling. This is God very present in the world. And there are, whirlwind, fire, earthquakes, these sorts of things are all associated with theophany, with God showing up. And yet it's interesting to me, in the midst of a book that could be described in a lot of ways as a whirlwind, this is the form God chooses. This is the form God chooses to speak in this book. God speaks out of the whirlwind. And it's interesting that this theophany happens because in a lot of ways, this is what Job and his friends have been demanding the whole time. Job has said again and again, I want God to show up. I want God to accuse me. I I want this trial and what's going on to be between me and God. And his friends again and again are just saying, look, you're a dirty sinner. That's clearly the only reason you're suffering this way. Therefore, if God shows up, you won't survive. God destroys the unjust. God does, good to the good, bad to the bad. And clearly you've had bad things, you're there. And so one of the most interesting things about this is Job is going to demand God show up and have this conversation. He gets a very different conversation than he, I think, wanted. And yet, he's also right. Beyond the philosophical system, beyond the pat answers, when he says, I trust in God and God's presence for my vindication, for I've put all my eggs into that basket. I'm trusting God. I think God is going to support me beyond your systems, your answers, your way of seeing the world. And in a lot of ways, he's right. God does show up. It's, again, a very different conversation than the one he's hoping to have. And yet the friend said again and again, you don't want God to show up. You couldn't survive it. And yet he does. And so that's an important kind of part of this. There's also some kind of, I would say, some sly writing tricks that whoever compiled, whoever we have that is responsible for this does. For a lot of the book of Job, not all of it, but a lot of it, God is almost always referred to in kind of the more vague term of just God, right? And yet here we're told very specifically, then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. And again, when you see that Lord all capitalized, that's the way in English we are referring to what's usually Yahweh or God's kind of personal name. I am who I am. This is a name that is revealed first and given significance to Moses when he is going back to free his people from Egypt, right? When God is sending him to bring them out of slavery, to start this Exodus event. And I think that the switch here in the conversation is a very intentional one. Not only is, God vaguely showing up, this vague God that they've been talking about, vague justice, abstract, philosophical ideas of suffering, and yet God, the Lord, Yahweh shows up, the God who is personal, the God who first revealed his name by saving those who were suffering and out of place. And so it's a very quick reference, and yet that change, I think, is significant for this. I think it's also significant because largely God's response is going to be asking questions, right? Job wants answers, but the question he's been asking is, where are you? And this first section is going to be dominated by God asking that exact same question to Job. Well, where were you? Where were you when I made the world the way it is? Since you seem to know all these answers, you've been saying, where are you, God? And God kind of reverses that. I think in a chance to enlarge what Job has to say. And so that's what we're going to sit with a little bit on Sunday of, okay, why is God using this method in which instead of giving answers, he continues to ask questions? Instead of explaining the way things are, he goes in a very different direction. What's the point of that? And so I think two big points come out of God's speeches. We got a little taste of them here, but they're going to continue. The first one is, when we are in pain, the world often feels like it is out of control, like everything is falling apart. It's so difficult to see beyond our own circumstances and our own pain. And I think the first thing God does, rather than offering comfort, rather than offering answers, is an enlarging of perspective. And he's going to say, basically, the argument is, okay, the world may feel chaotic. The world may feel out of control. But whether you can see it or not, whether you can feel it or not, God is arguing that the world is, in fact, on solid foundations. The references to chaos in here, which again are culturally, they would have gotten immediately. The sea, to a desert people, represents the uncontrollable chaos, the forces of evil and unrestrained destruction in the world, right? The sea almost always uses that. In this section, it's not just the sea either. The actual translation is the original word for that, which was a sea god representing chaos and evil and those sorts of things, right? And so, yet God actually depersonifies it. It's just the sea again, but the sea representing chaos and all those things. And God has put it in its place. The world is on good foundations, even if it doesn't seem like it, even if it doesn't feel like it to Job. Another really important part of Job, and I think one that has gotten a lot of attention more recently as our world is kind of facing ecological crisis, is Job. God is going to argue with Job that many things kind of beyond his places of comfort, many things beyond his places of knowledge are in fact valuable to God. So he's going to talk about these barren places. He's going to talk about the animals that live there, and that God loves and values these things that are outside of Job's experience, that Job and his pain, or even humanity and their confusion and pain, is not the entire world. There are other things going on. There are places that God delights in that we would, I think, traditionally call chaotic places, unsafe places, the wildernesses, the fringes, those sorts of things, right? And I think this is a very important theological argument that the book is going to do, whereas we tend to conflate those things, chaos and evil and suffering and pain. I think God is wanting to separate those in some ways, that chaos and danger and the potential harm in the world is part of the way God made the creation. It can have its limits, it can be in its proper place, or it can be something that overruns and destroys and do those things. And so again, God doesn't actually answer what Job is wanting to hear. He changes his perspective, he widens his perspective, whereas Job and those of us most of the time in pain want things to be comfortable and easy. We want all the pieces to fit. God doesn't seem that concerned with that. They want to have a good system in which everything makes sense, and God instead is offering, in a lot of ways, his own chaos back into that, his own mystery, his own unknowns into that. And so while we, especially in places of pain, want answers, God is in fact going to again say, will you trust me? Because God moves in this story. God comes and meets Job in his places of pain, not with answers, but with his presence. I am here. I am in the midst. I am even appearing as the storm itself, which is something that you probably feel, something Job probably feels like a bit of a whirlwind himself in so many ways, in the just intense physical, emotional, spiritual pain that he is in at the moment. And so it's a message that I get frustrated with. I would like comfort. I would like answers. And yet, I think the answer that God is sometimes giving is that we couldn't understand those answers. We can't see all the bigger perspective. We can't see what God is doing. And I think Job, at the end of this conversation, puts his hand over his mouth. He just says, you know what, I was demanding answers. I was demanding things all make sense. And I think, frankly, if they did, we would likely be disappointed most of the times. The scale of what God is up to, of which we, even in our pain, are only part, is an invitation out of becoming so small and narrow, and our entire world being that. And so I think Job's stance throughout the entire book was, if God shows up, I trust your judgment on things. And I think the question that God asks back to him is, okay, you say you trust me. You say you want my judgment on things. Do you actually trust me if you don't get what you want out of the end? If you don't get clean, pat answers? If the world actually is the way I designed it? If even the chaos of the world has its place and its restraint, even when it runs over you and harms you, I am stepping into that. I am moving into those places with my presence. And again, Job is not the only conversation in the Bible around these things. I think it will be enriched by other places of God tabernacling, of God coming to be among people, especially, of course, in Jesus' life, right? Coming to suffer among humanity, that complete healing is possible. But Job is not there, just like we are often not there in the whole perspective when he is in a place of pain. And so I think for us in our frustrations, we have to admit to ourselves, will I still trust if I don't get answers, especially not the answers I want? Do I trust that God knows what he's doing? Do I trust the foundation of the world is actually good and chaos is kept in its place and pain and suffering are something that God can handle? I think that's the challenge to us. And then for those of us who are not immediately in that place, what does it mean to follow a God who does not offer answers when we as Christians have often pretended like we have answers to things we don't? What does it mean to offer instead of answers or pat easy verses or whatever? What does it mean to offer our presence, our own whirlwind in some ways, our own perspective in those places of pain? Not good answers in this section. I ended up with just more questions. I'm struggling and wrestling with this, but it doesn't make it easy. It doesn't make it make sense. And the book of Job, I think, very intentionally leaves us in that place. So the invitation is, will you wrestle with this, God? Will you see what it looks like to have our perspectives drawn and stretched, even if it isn't the answers we want? It's scarier that way, but God seems to think it's going to be better in some way. We're not really going to know unless we go with him on that journey.